Welcome to the Tactics Meeting, Episode 14, Marine Salvage, with Todd Duke from Resolve Marine. I'm your host, Dan Smiley, and here on the Tactics Meeting, we review best practices, response tactics and tools, and talk to subject matter experts to bring you the best information in the marine oil spill response industry. In this episode, we try to demystify the business of marine salvage, look at the contracts under which salvage is performed, and talk about clauses such as scoping. Let's get started. Welcome to the Tactics Meeting. Today, we're really fortunate to have Mr. Todd Duke, General Manager of Compliance Services for Resolve Marine, to talk to us about the business of marine salvage. Todd, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll just introduce myself a little bit. I've been with Resolve for going on 22 years now. I originally started out in the U.S. Navy as a damage controlman, all sorts of engineering work and that sort of stuff. And from there, I became a firefighter and got into the civilian fire department role and then into the industrial firefighting setting, because the industrial departments paid much better and it was more about firefighting and less about medical things like you find in the municipal fire department setting. And so there I wound up running Resolve's fire school back in 1999. Resolve started in the 1980s, and in 1990, OPA 90 came about. And so part of the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 was to make sure that there were contracted salvage services. And Joe Farrell, the owner of Resolve, decided that they needed a marine firefighting school, because most of the people that he worked with didn't really know much about firefighting, particularly on ships. And so in 1992, they set about building a fantastic marine firefighting structure down in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, inside Port Everglades. And in 99, I was selected to run it and came in and got most of their courses U.S. Coast Guard approved for merchant mariners. So if you've taken the basic and marine firefighting course at one of the various schools around the United States, you know sort of what we were teaching, as well as a little bit different structured approach for teaching the salvers and the divers and the people that were responding different types of marine firefighting tactics, so that when they went on board a ship fire, they were familiar, they were knowledgeable, and weren't going to hurt themselves. So
yep, I've taken that course. I took the basic and advanced. I needed it for my mate's license.
Right. So if you went to Fremont,
I did. I went to Fremont. That was the first one. India Tango it was at the time.
Good. That structure was built a whole lot on the same structure as down there in Florida. So myself and John Kirchhoff, the former owner of Fremont, we used to trade ideas an awful lot, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, I took my original basic and advanced there. I took one refresher there, and then I did a refresher up at North Bend.
Now you need to come to Florida and take a refresher.
I should come to Florida and take a refresher. I skipped my last refresher. I went ahead and let the STCW portion of my license lapse. So I'm now only carrying the domestic side of the license. But I don't sail anyway. Right. Yeah, I looked at the structure on the website. It looks like an amazing school there in Fort Lauderdale.
It is. And we've had about 30,000 mariners come through in the last 20 some odd years. It primarily is suited for, as far as merchant mariners are concerned, obviously the cruise ship crews and the mega yacht cruise, simply because that's the primary types of vessels that are around the South Florida area. But yeah, we've had tons of experience. That's one of the only, maybe the only marine firefighting school in the United States that's MCA certified, which is the UK Coast Guard. And that's mostly due to the mega yacht crowd that they service. So,
is that more stringent than the U.S. requirements, or is it just different?
It's a little bit different. You know, it's a little bit different a certification scheme, obviously, and we would have UK members come over and do audits and that sort of thing. The interesting thing was, from an educational level, the U.S. Coast Guard requires a multiple choice examination so that as an auditor comes through, they can quickly take a punch card key, you know, and look and double check the examination answer sheet to make sure that people are passing the test the way that they're supposed to. The UK takes a different approach and requires a large part to be a written exam, and that is kind of tough on the instructors because you just can't throw that key up there and look. You got to actually read it and think about it and decide whether or not the students actually grasp the concept of whatever they're talking about, you know, because it's all essay type answers. So that was probably the biggest difference, you know, and a little bit of nomenclature, you know, but I can tell you, you know, fire pretty much burns the same way here as it does in Asia or the United Kingdom or wherever you're at in the world.
Physics pretty much stays the same all across the globe.
Yep, sure.
So tell me a little bit about salvage. How would you define salvage? What is a salvage?
So, yeah, salvage is kind of pretty much saving something of value. That's one of the key factors in commercial salvage is saving something of value. A lot of times people confuse salvage with other types of maritime emergency response, but we've actually kind of moved into the maritime emergency response role. One of my colleagues came up with the vague assumption based on debatable figures taken from inconclusive evidence performed with instruments of problematic accuracy by persons of doubtful reliability and questionable mentality. So that's often how we define salvage. You know, it's basically a vessel that's in peril, and a person coming along, and to be true salvage, it has to be voluntary. So I'm coming along and I find a vessel in peril and I take some action to help save the life and the property and the value that's built into that ship.
So like I take it in tow, I pass it some pumps, I come aboard and I help fight the fire, that kind of thing?
All of those things, you know. A lot of times, you know, it's just doing different things. You know, I've seen cases where someone was awarded simply because they had a screwdriver available and they tightened the clamp, but tightening that clamp stopped that vessel from flooding, and therefore they saved something of value. So
you'd say we're awarded. So that's really one of the key pieces of historical salvage, right? I come along, I voluntarily assist you in saving something of value and saving your vessel. And I am then awarded for that action a portion of the value of the thing I helped to save. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
And I remember reading this story. It's a great book called Yonder is the Sea, full of sea stories. And it tells the story of this passenger liner captain. I think in this story, he worked for the White Star Line. And due to foggy weather, unexpected currents, Anyway, he ended up holding the vessel, and a tug came ripping out of the fog. And the story goes that, this tug captain had been waiting his whole life for this opportunity for salvage, right? And he's offering a tow line, and the captain, wanting to not give away the value of the vessel in salvage, yells at him quite harshly to stay away from his ship. And then he proceeds to deballast and drop his anchors and do all these things to finally get it back off the rocks. But he didn't accept the salvage, right? It has to be voluntary.
It's got to be voluntary, and so there's what's called the black wall factors, and these are some when a arbitration panel looks at the case. If it's a true Lloyd's open forum case, an arbitration panel will look at it, and they will look at those black wall factors, and those are the degree of danger the vessel's in, the value post casualty, so how much of the cargo, how much of the bunkers, how much of the vessel was saved, how much risk was incurred in saving the property from whatever peril that it was in. So obviously, if I'm going on board and putting out a fire and I'm doing an interior firefighting, if you will, my life is at a greater risk trying to save this vessel than my earlier example of a guy with a screwdriver tightening up a hose clamp to stop some flooding. So what sort of risk am I incurring as the salver? What kind of skill and energy displayed in order to render the salvage service? So firefighting obviously takes a little bit more skill and a whole lot more energy than just simply tightening up a clamp. The value of the property that's employed by the salver. So, for example, once again, firefighting, I've got $1,000 suit that I'm wearing, $1,000 or $3,000 SCBA that I'm wearing, hose, pumps, all of this expensive equipment versus a guy with a screwdriver. So what's the value of what I'm bringing to bear? And then once again, the danger that I exposed my equipment to, so in the example that you were giving, I bring my tug out there. Well, one rogue wave, is my tug going to wind up over there on the rocks the same as this the casualty vessel? And so certainly if that's the case, then the arbitration panel will look and perhaps give me more money. And then, of course, the overall cost in terms of labor and material that these salvers have expended in rendering the salvage or this aid. So, how much fuel did I burn? How much oxygen did I burn? How much was the tow line that I used? All the different consumables that we put in, as well as how much effort and amount of people that we put towards the problem. And so this is time honored. This has been around for hundreds of years, but it's changed a little bit. Particularly in 1989, the International Salvage Convention updated the International Salvage Convention in 1910. And so a safety net was added for salvers. So, for example, in the case that you were referring to, the vessel is on the rocks, it's being pounded. The salver comes and the idea is, wait, we need to lighten this vessel to refloat it, okay? We've got a major hurricane coming, so we need to hurry up and refloat this vessel really quickly, or else we're going to lose all of our value, because now we're going to have the vessel's going to be broken apart. And so years ago, and I have never been a part of something like this, but years ago, they would jettison fuel. just pump the oil right over the side because, hey, taking weight off the boat. Now get it over, get it refloated. Can you imagine that happening today?
No, today you're going to jail for that.
Exactly.
I mean, today, half of the reason, maybe most of the reason for the salvage activities is to prevent the environmental damage. It's not even to save the vessel necessarily. The cost of the environmental damage may exceed by orders of magnitude the value of the vessel. So stopping that environmental damage, that's goal one. Would you agree with that?
Exactly. And that's where we changed a little bit and we became more focused on saving the environment or preventing damage to the environment. And,
so no more pumping fuel overboard.
Well, or, one of the things that, oftentimes you just like, okay, go out there, get me 10 tugs, grab hold of this and just pull it off. And sometimes that works. Sometimes they rip the bottom out, tear a fuel tank open, and 50 tons, 100 tons, 1,000 tons of fuel gets dumped overboard. And well, no more of that either. Now you will see that oftentimes we will sit and we will bring in lots of people and lots of equipment, and we're there. Our sole focus is to remove that fuel first before we even think about pulling this thing off the rocks and taking this fuel out. So we're preventing that environmental damage. So these things are new things that are being taken into account now as we move into a more environmentally conscious world, if you will.
So early salvage was about rendering assistance voluntarily, but today almost every vessel, maybe every vessel, certainly every vessel trading in the United States is required by law to have a pre-identified salvage contractor that is available to be called. So that's not really voluntary anymore, is it? Right? You've agreed in advance to provide services for salvage. So how does that change the dynamic? Do you still get awarded part of the value? Are you now doing it with fixed rates for a job? How did that change salvage?
So it has changed a little bit, and there's still a couple of different types. There's a number of different types of contracts out. Now, first off, let me state that I'm an operations guy. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a commercial guy. So
that is a really good point. I'm going to tell everybody, neither one of us are lawyers. We don't play a lawyer on TV. We are not providing legal advice.
Right. So if I don't get this 100% correct, don't shoot me. But in general terms, so we start out with the Lloyd's open form, which is kind of the salvage contract where you're still awarded some sort of value. Now,
so let's pause there for just a second. Even though I own, motor vessel ABC, I cite Resolve Marine in my response plan as my salvage and marine firefighting contractor. So I don't know how the fee structure works. Anyway, I've done whatever it takes to be able to cite you in my plan. Once I activate you, do we still at that point then sign an additional salvage contract?
Yeah. So
okay.
Under OPA 90, the salvage marine firefighting section of the regulations, there is the requirement for a funding agreement. Okay, and so the idea is there is an immediate response. So we have agreed in Resolve's case, the agreement is to utilize scopic rates, which we'll talk about in a moment. But we have agreed that, the call comes in, we will immediately do a remote assessment and consultation, figure out what the problem is, figure out what the needs are, and start an appropriate response. Now, that may be simply talking through some things with the master. It may be getting one of our engineers on the phone with the master or the chief engineer to talk through some issues, giving some guidance to the chief officer about rigging tugs and that sort of thing, or moving some weight around. All of this is determined during the remote assessment, where it's just some phone conversations taking place, to actually launching vessels and people and aircraft and lots of equipment going towards a casualty scene. It all depends on what the situation is. But it starts with that remote assessment where the qualified individual or the captain will notify the salver, hey, here's the case, here's all the information that we've got, and we start building that initial ICS picture, if you will, the 201. We start building that so that we've got an instant action picture and figuring out what the problem is and what we can do about it. So that's kind of where it starts. Now, under that funding agreement, it does allow, because the funding agreement is there for an immediate response, to make sure that an immediate response occurs. The salvers in the US have basically we all have some similar wording in our funding agreement that says within the appropriate amount of time that this contract will be negotiated for a different salvage contract. Because the Coast Guard was very clear in their regulation. They wanted an immediate response. Okay, fine, I want an immediate response. You look over here in the case of the insurers, the hull and the P&I insurers, all of their lawyers and everything, well, they want an ironclad solid contract. And here the salver's caught in the middle. And it's really hard for both the salver and the ship owner to sign a contract in regards to a casualty that hasn't occurred, may never occur. And that's why you have this funding agreement that guarantees an immediate response.
So it kind of looks like, if I'm looking at this from an ICS perspective, that initial funding agreement and plan citation is kind of like reactive phase, right? Up to the 201 briefing. Hey, we're gonna take your phone call. We're gonna do a remote consultation and assessment. We're gonna activate equipment and start it coming your way. And then at that point, we're going to sign an actual salvage contract based on the kind of work that we perceive is going to be done.
And, so let's talk about real world. And the case that you and I recently worked together, which will remain unnamed. Unnamed. So that entire response was done under the funding agreement. Somewhere, probably about day 4, we actually signed a BIMCO rec hire. BIMCO is the Baltic Intermediate Maritime. I can't remember what all BIMCO stands for. But anyway, the BIMCO contracts are standard form contracts in the maritime industry that the International Group of P&I Clubs has accepted all the terms and conditions. It's been vetted by all the major ship owners and everything. And so it's a multi-page contract that everybody's vetted. So you don't have to sit there and negotiate 14 pages of third-party liability and that sort of thing, going back and forth between lawyers. It's already done. Quick fill in the blank things in certain boxes that are incident specific. And so after the casualty occurs is when the lawyers want to get involved. And so utilizing a BIMCO contract. But as you saw, it did not stop a response. We came in full bore with lots of people and lots of equipment and was taking care of the casualty while the lawyers are over there in the corner doing their thing.
No, you very definitely assumed that other stuff will get taken care of in the background. We're saving the ship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Saving the ship, saving the environment. But most importantly, the response is taking place as the Coast Guard and the various other regulatory agencies want it to happen. But, you know, there was a lot of, and this is where the whole OPA 90 and the funding agreements occurred, was, you know, lots of foreign ships traveling through and everything. I've got a bit of a relationship with this company, but, you know, I have a hard time getting them to pay my retainer bill, you know, and now they want me to go out on the hook for, you know, $1 million or $2 million worth of whatever, you know, and it's like, and it wasn't just the salvage community, it was the oil spill response community as well. And so there were lots of people that were hesitant to put their capital at risk, if you will. And so that's where the qualified individual company and spill management teams kind of sprung from, and the ability for them to write checks out of the owner's checkbook, so to speak, you know, and to help start the funding of those operations until the right people with the right authority can come over from Singapore or United Kingdom or wherever, you know, the owners are from, you know. So it's all about making sure the response occurs, even if it's 2 o'clock on a Saturday night or, you know, early Sunday morning. So,
are you more often called by the vessel master or the owner, or more often by the qualified individual?
I would say it's probably a 70-30, 65-35 kind of. The QI makes the call, and then the vessel master, and then we will contact the vessel master, because generally, and if you look at the vessel response plan, you know, they're supposed to call the Coast Guard, they're supposed to call the QI, state, local, a whole bunch of things. But in general, if the vessel master will reach out directly to the QI, and then the QI has the processes in place to make all these other notifications. So primarily, that vessel master needs to contact the Coast Guard, and then he needs to contact his QI. Most of the time, the QI will notify us. Like I said, 25-30% of the time, we will get a call directly from a vessel. Most of that is when it's a light grounding, you know, and they're trying to just pull it off themselves, and or maybe use a couple of harbor tugs that are close by, and you know, they want somebody to second check them. But anything real, most of the time, the call comes from the QI.
We use the Baltic form salvage agreement on the job that we were involved in together. What are some of the other more common or as common contracts that you do work under?
Well, so BIMCO is an organization, and they produce most of the contracts. So there's a tow hire, and we oftentimes will utilize just the tow hire for an emergency towing operation. So you've got a vessel, quite often happens out here where I'm at, out in the middle of the Aleutians, has a mechanical casualty. The vessel's really not in much peril. She's just broke and out there floating around.
Unless she's in Unimac Pass.
Yeah, unless she's in Unimac Pass, but they need you know, some tugs to bring them into port so that they can get repaired. So we'll utilize a tow hire contract, which is the exact same contract that I would utilize if I was towing someone's barge from port A to port B, you know, delivering containers of whatever cargo.
So that's not really salvage. It's just assistance.
No, it's assistance. And
it's a job.
Right. And so but it's one of the contracts that we would utilize. You know, we did a job not too long ago that we went out under a tow con, but we left the door open for a salvage claim because of the extremely bad nature of potential nature of the weather that we were facing, and so
So like the tug and the crew had to put themselves at some risk in order to be able to take this vessel in tow, and that additional risk you felt left salvage on the table.
Well, exactly.
Okay.
Or it could have if the weather had gotten, much worse the way that the weather can get out here. It's any given day it's 6 feet or it's 22 feet. It just depends on the day out here in the winter anyway. So. Yeah,
my last trip for Western Pioneer across the Gulf, it used to take us 3.5 days to go from Sand Point to Dixon Entrance. Took me 9 days pounding into that head sea at 70, 80 mile an hour winds. We were making less than 3 knots most of the time.
So you understand peril.
I do. Matter of fact, my very last trip for Western Pioneer, and they had some old ships. We were coming out of Sandpoint area, Sandpoint, King Cove area, and we were taking on some ice, and the chief engineer went to transfer some fuel internally, and the deck vents for the fuel tanks, the ball valves were frozen. And so he pressurized the receiving tank against that frozen ball valve, and it split a seam in the tank. So now I've got a 4-peak full of fuel. And because of that, I've got a 5-degree list. And once we took on that steady list, we were in it was about 40, 45 knots of wind, 15, 20-foot seas. Some of the cargo shifted. So now we've got like a 7-degree list. Yeah, good times.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Those are the times I live for. But so there's a couple other ones. So we talked about the no cure, no pay, Lloyd's open form, which means we don't agree to a price. The arbitrators will take all those black wall factors and decide what we should get paid at the end of the day.
So you're taking all the risk. You're putting out all the expense. You're mobilizing people, equipment, spending tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions.
Yep.
Hoping that you are going to be able to provide a cure that will result in an award.
Right.
But you might not. It might be all loss.
It might be all loss, or it might be, if you don't save a lot of the cargo, or you burn up an engine room in a fire, that's the high value part of the vessel is the engine room. You lose that, well, now you got a bunch of scrap steel. You still saved a bunch of scrap, but your award's much lower.
So at some point you're looking at a guy, I hope I'm going to break even on this job.
Well, sometimes, yeah. And so the arbitration panel looks at best endeavors, and when they look at best endeavors, they also look at all the salvers in the world, and quite often they will call experts from other companies or other regions of the world, and they will say, here's the scenario. What would you do in this case? And they'll compare it against what was actually done, and that sort of thing. So there's a bit of Monday morning quarterbacking, if you will, that goes on as this. And then there's also a surveyor, if you will. He's called a special casualty representative. He is appointed by the insurer, and he comes in, and he is technically the vessel owner, if you will, at that particular time. He is there to watch over the salver and make sure that the salver is providing best endeavors. And he's going to take good, thorough notes. Most of these guys, well, all of these guys have been vessel masters in the past. Many of them have been salvage masters, but nearly 90% of them all have been big ship, tankers, container vessels, something like that. And they work directly for the insurer of the vessel. So, and they're pretty neutral. They're appointed by the international. They're appointed by the P&I clubs. So
Okay.
there's 10 or 12 of them worldwide, maybe a few more, but there's not very many. And it's a group of P&I clubs that appoint these guys, or in some cases girls. And so they go out there, they're integrated, you know, as part of the salvage branch, and they sit there and they just document, and they'll sit down in front of the arbitration panel and say, these guys did a great job, or yeah, I wouldn't have done that, I wouldn't have done this, you know, and all the ones that I've personally worked with, they've all been very fair with me, as best as I can tell, because when they're sitting in front of the arbitration panel, obviously it's a closed door meeting, so we don't know exactly. But, you know, they also, when I'm going to go and I'm going to spend a large amount of money, I go and I talk to this guy. I say, yeah, we're going to mobilize this, you know, 2 more tugs because we think we need it, and this is why we think we need it. And he's going to say, yep, I agree, or nope, you shouldn't be spending that kind of money, you know, because remember, one of the factors is how much money I personally spent, you know. And so if I'm just spending money willy-nilly to hopefully raise my award, he's going to call me on it, right?
So you have a vested interest in making your response as large as it can be.
Yes.
Or
under an LOF.
Okay.
Under an LOF. Right. But we're also professionals.
I would never suggest that someone would just throw equipment onto a response for no reason at all.
There are companies out there that do that, though. Much smaller regional ones, particularly in other parts of the world. But you know, we have a reputation in the insurance industry for, you know, blue water insurance, the P&I markets mostly, and our reputation is very good. And the other salvage companies that are big ones, like, you know, Smith and TNT and some of the other larger ones, we all have a vested interest in making sure that our reputation stays intact, because we do want the next job. and if you're felt like you're abusing privilege, then oftentimes you won't get the next job.
Yeah. I mean, that's right. I mean, it's reputation is everything. And we watched some organizations, and I won't name any, during Deepwater Horizon, that felt like picking up the golden eggs wasn't good enough. Here was an opportunity to own the goose, and they really went all out, and they kind of had people over a barrel, and so they got their goose rates, but when it was over, they never got another job again.
Exactly. And so, you know, we all want pie, but you can't have the whole.
You can't have the whole pie.
Fair share.
That's right.
So then, because there's a little bit of difference between salvage, which is more kind of emergency response, what we're going to do, and then there's wreck removal, and oftentimes wreck removal is after the salvage occurs, or if a salvage really isn't going to occur. So we do the environmental salvage. So take, for example, the golden wreck. You know, a company comes in, they assess it, they extinguish what little bit of fire was left, they pull the people off. They did the bulk of the fuel removal. This is all what I would consider salvage. And they made it safe for the environment. Now, okay, let's back up. Let's take a look. Now we're in a wreck removal phase. And
which is a whole nother project.
Whole nother project. It's got time for engineering, well thought out and everything. And depending on what it is and where it is and a whole lot of different factors, companies will negotiate with the insurance underwriters, and because oftentimes these wreck removals go out for tender, and many of them go out lump sum. So they say, okay, here's my wrecked vessel. It needs to go away. How much are you going to charge me? And so we'll say, okay, it's $1,000, just to use a round number, $1,000. Okay. So if I don't remove that vessel, I get paid nothing. So it's called no cure, no pay lump sum. So if I do remove it and it only cost me $10, I made $990, right? If it cost me $900, guess what? I made $100, but I still got paid my $1,000, and it's based on, it's a bidded contract. Most salvers don't like lump sums. Most lump sum contracts will have various clauses out there because you can't predict the weather, really. And most areas where a vessel turns into a major wreck removal is in areas that's got the world's worst weather, or, it's an extremely difficult area to work in due to rocky shores or that sort of thing, and then just things happen. So lump sums aren't good for really anybody other than the underwriter, because he knows it's going to cost him X amount of dollars.
Do you know anything about the removal of the remaining bits of hull from the new Carissa?
No, I haven't heard new Carissa mentioned in probably 5 or 6 years. It's something that's kind of fell off everybody's radar. So
no, because it was there for years after the oil spill response, and then they went out and got a contract for wreck removal. I'm fairly certain they could only work about 3 months out of the year on the Oregon coast, and they built kind of a temporary pier and breakwater, and I'm not sure how many seasons they had to work. It was at least 2. I wish I knew more about it. I thought you might.
So the salvage master was a good friend of mine. He's since passed away, but he told me a little bit about it. I'm not as well versed as I should be, other than the fact they built a really cool gondola to get from the wreck to the shore back and forth, and so but it's things like that that really drive up some of the cost. I mean, we did a similar vessel over in New Zealand, and the name's escaping me right at the moment, but most of the steel that we pulled off the vessel had to be flown out via helicopter, and that gets hugely expensive. The Selendang IU, all the oil had to be flown out via helicopter, and it's just because of the environment that you're actually working in, and so it can be done. It's just how much is it going to cost, and so, flying sheets of steel out or tons of fuel out or whatever, it gets hugely expensive.
Yeah, those are big birds you have to fly to do that. It's not like you're using a Robinson 22 to lift that stuff.
Right. So the next type, day rate contracts. And so that's probably one of the most common types, day rate, or oftentimes called a time and material contract, So, and I mentioned scopic earlier. So a true LOF, once again, like I said, is no cure, no pay. So if the hurricane comes along and destroys the vessel and destroys the cargo and everything, and there's really no value left, you get nothing unless we declare scoping. And scoping is a special compensation clause, which basically what that does is once the salver declares scoping, his award's automatically lowered by about 30%. So if you were going to give me $1,000, now I'm only going to get $700. But it does guarantee that I'm going to get paid my time and material rate based on a set published rates that the International Salvage Union publishes every 2 or 3 years. They adjust those rates. And so most OPA salvage marine firefighting funding agreements utilize that scoping rate. So it gives, a general rate for tugs and dive equipment and air compressors and pumps and hose and all the different types of tools and bits of stuff that we utilize for salvage. And so what that does, though, is, and in a case I was involved in probably 2006, 2007, somewhere in that neighborhood, we were doing an LOF on a cargo ship, and it was a pretty hard grounding in Texas. She's stuck in the mud. So pull out all this bulk cargo to lighter the vessel and refloat it. No big deal, except for the fact that there's a hurricane coming up in the Gulf of Mexico. And so as you're sitting there and you're watching the trajectory path, and that cone gets narrower and narrower, and at one point in time, my boss decided it's in our best interest to declare scoping. That way, if...
Can you do that at any time?
Yes.
Up until, not after the hurricane has passed. You can't look at the wreck and go, scoping.
No, there still has to be, yeah. You can't destroy the thing and then declare scoping. You have to do it in advance. So the salver's taking a bit of risk as well, a bit of financial risk as well. And so, we saw it and we're like, if this is a direct hit, it's going to destroy everything and there's going to be nothing left. So, and as we've seen, like I said, this was kind of after 2005, where we had Katrina, Rita, Wilma, and 50 other hurricanes blow through the Gulf of Mexico that year and pretty much decimate a lot of the Gulf states. And so we're looking at it and saying, yeah, it's really not worth the risk. So let's declare scoping. A whole lot of salvage nowadays is based on scoping rates and utilization of scoping clauses, simply because of the fact that there's a whole lot of environmental things that we have to do, and things that the regulators require us to do that actually goes against the detriment of pure salvage, and so, for example, in a major ship fire, somebody may want to just charge on there and with all sorts of firefighting foam or whatever and do their best to put it out and save all the cargo. That's not necessarily in the best interest of the environment. And if they roll the vessel over, it may be putting the environment at a greater risk. But he's doing his best to maximize his reward, right? But the Coast Guard's there, standing there saying, nope, you're not doing that. Or the state agency saying, nope, you're not going to do that. Or nope, we want you to do something else. That's where, sometimes we're doing things nowadays, and you go back to that environmental salvage, if you would. We're doing things nowadays to protect the environment, protect human health. Back in the 1800s, early 1900s, it was all about saving property. Now it's saving people, it's saving the environment, and hopefully there's some property left at the end of the day. And so in some of those some of those clauses, there may be bonus provisions, there may be some shared cost. The latest operation you and I were involved with, there was quite a bit of shared cost between us and the responsible party, simply because they're very self-sufficient kind of people. And so, because it was where it was at, it was much easier for us to utilize some of their existing commercial relationships with people like ammonia people and fuel people and that sort of thing, instead of those contracts going through me, so
the responsible party arranged for having the fuel removed, arranged for having the ammonia removed, not something that you had to do. You had to coordinate with them, but you didn't.
Right. We were there as technical expertise or safety people or whatever, but some of the actual operations that were done by those third party contractors, that was always all arranged by the third part, by the responsible party, if you will. So, and so that's sometimes, you're sitting in some of these unified command meetings and the salvers over there going, yeah, maybe. And the Coast Guard of the state's looking at him like, how come he doesn't know? And it's because you're waiting on the responsible party sometimes to give you an answer or give you some marching orders or something like that. Because at the end of the day, the salver works for the responsible party and his insurer. And I think that's sort of what's missed. While we take direction from the unified command, I actually work for the responsible party and his insurer. It sometimes puts the salvage representative that's in the command post sometimes in an uncomfortable situation sometimes, particularly when you're trying to be tactful and there's disagreements on whatever, whether it be an operational tactic or spending money or whatever it is. When we walk into a situation, it's not always, it's seldom ever a good situation. There's property at risk, there's the environment at risk, and quite often there's people at risk. So
the other contractors are kind of in the same position too, right? The OSRO, their agreement is with the responsible party, not with the unified command. The wildlife rehabilitation people, same kind of thing. So they're all kind of working for the responsible party, but taking direction from the unified command. Where does salvage fit in the incident command system? Where does it belong in the org chart? I know where NIMS says it goes, but then there's some disagreement out there as to where people think it belongs. What are your thoughts?
Well, so we primarily belong in the operations section, simply because that's mostly what we're doing. Is we're providing operations. We're doing operations of some sort or another. And when you look at the global picture of a large oil spill response, for example, we've got to work hand in hand with our OSRO brothers, because they're putting boom around a vessel, or they're doing this, or they're doing that, or they're, closing off canals, creeks, waterways that I need open in order to get barges and tugs and whatever I need for my operation in and out. You have to work together. And so it's always good to have the majority of the salvage as a unit of the operations section. So a salvage branch or salvage unit.
I mostly picture it as a branch in operations. Now, not as a group, but as a branch generally.
We oftentimes will put someone in both the logistics and also the planning section. And the reason why is because there's a huge amount of planning that goes into salvage operations. And a lot of it is extensive engineering. We've got engineers who are doing structural analysis and all sorts of things. And going through and making those plans. And then once again, like I said, we need to take those plans that we're creating and work them in with our brethren over on the Osro side to make sure that we can get this equipment in, that we can conduct our operations so that they don't necessarily hinder whatever's going on the Osro side. And then on the logistics side, particularly when you get into some of the smaller, more remote areas, salvers tend to create a fairly big footprint sometimes, you know, and so let's just talk simple things like tank barges or frac tanks, for example. Come in, there's 2 tank barges available. Well, the Osro wants them all so that he can put all his skim product in it. And the salver wants it so he can take all the fuel off the vessel and put it in there. And there's only 2, and the next 2 are like, you know, 10 days away or whatever. So what do you do? Where do you go? Who gets the barge? And so that's why, you know, a salver needs to be part of logistics section so that, you know, he can voice his concerns. He can voice his needs. Because I've actually seen it. And you brought up BP. BP was probably the worst that I've seen it, but I've seen it.
For salvage, you mean?
Well, for logistics problems. And I've seen it happen after hurricanes as well, where the local vendors, they know what they got. They know they're the only game in town. And so they'll turn around and they'll offer the barge to resolve for $1,000 a day. They'll offer it NRC for $1,200 a day. Then they come back and say, oh, NRC is going to offer it for $1,200. So I'm going to offer it to you for $1,300. And they'll sit there and they'll play this game back and forth between the salver and the Osro. You know, and all that's doing is driving up the cost of the response. And I've seen it happen. And I saw it happen extensively at BP, especially some of these guys were coming out of the upper Midwest with boom and this sort of stuff, you know. And the area that I was working in, there were 3 main sites, and all the site manager, I was a site manager, and then there was a site manager from 2 different companies to the other 2 sites. And we used to call each other, you know, all right, here comes so-and-so. He wants, you know, $10 a foot for this boom. Call me back and let me know what he offers it to you for, you know. And so that's where that logistics section and making sure that there's representative from the Osro, representative from the salver, representative from the various different branches from the operations section are represented so that we're not bidding against each other and that sort of thing, you know.
If a response is primarily salvage, let's say for the sake of argument that we haven't actually spilled any oil yet. We've mobilized our Osro due to the threat of environmental damage. But at the moment, it's primarily salvage. Would you envision a person from salvage ask, say, the ops section chief or a deputy ops section chief as opposed to a branch director in that case?
So we've always left it to the Coast Guard. I have been the deputy ops section chief more than once. In my experience, the ops section chief has always been a Coast Guard person, generally the chief of IMD for whatever sector that you're in. But I have been the deputy ops section chief simply because that's the person that you know, you're in the command and general staff meeting, you know, okay, operations, the lieutenant will stand up. Yeah, so we've got this going on and Todd's going to tell you about what's going on in salvage, you know, and so then I give my brief, you know, and sometimes, you know, they will just brief from the various groups or whatever you want to call them, you know. In the case that we work together, the incident commander would look at me and say, okay, tell me about the firefighting operation. And then he'd look at the guy from the Osro and say, tell me about the oil spill response operation. Okay, now we'll move on. You know, I don't ever see us progressing beyond maybe the deputy ops section chief. Quite frankly, you'll never see us as a member of the unified command, even though, as we talked about earlier, there is a case to be made that under the LOF, the salver or the SCR, if you will, actually is more guy that's responsible for that vessel, particularly if it's kind of like a chartered vessel, because it gets really, really gray whenever you're looking at a vessel that's chartered. And so the VRP holder is the charterer, but he just turns around and hands the vessel back to the owner and says, "Oh, this is your problem now." The response still occurs underneath that particular VRP. And so it gets really weird. And so that's why sometimes LOFs are more preferred, because during the entire casualty situation, they look at that salvage master as being the vessel master.
Is it simplistic to say that once you've entered into a Lloyd's open form agreement, that the salver, in the person of the salvage master, for practical purposes, becomes the owner of the vessel?
I wouldn't say owner, but I would say the vessel master. And that's kind of why we call him a salvage master. And most salvage masters have been vessel masters in the past.
So you've signed this open loads form. We have the vessel master there. Would they be in the salvage branch? Would the salvage master be the branch director, or would you have somebody else as the salvage branch director?
So typically we have someone else do that. And the reason why is because that salvage master has got a lot of things on his mind and a lot of responsibility and he doesn't have the time really to sit through a lot of the meetings that are required to function properly under ICS. And oftentimes you will see a salvage company and they're running a little mini ICS off to the side.
Well, that is a model that I've seen. That is really the other model, is those who see the incident command system as being primarily responsible for oil spill, wildlife mitigation, environmental cleanup, while the salvage is looked at as a separate project that then gets a liaison to the incident command system. Now, I'm not sure that I agree with that approach, but that is one way people have depicted it in org charts and whatnot.
And I've seen that too. And thankfully we're merging more towards the center. And a lot of that is based on a couple of things. One, a lot of us salvers that started out in the United States come from the U.S. Coast Guard background. So they're former Coast Guard officers, naval architects, or operations people, or whatever.
Right, strike team members.
Right. And so we tend to attract a lot of those guys after they're done with their service.
And they know ICS.
They do. That has worked in our favor, bring us a little bit closer together. And then the other thing is, like I was telling you, was resources. We all lean on third parties in the town that the incident occurs. When you've got a primary Osro and a primary salver, and they're both calling the same guys, looking for the same equipment, it's driving the cost up or whatever, and it's not good for the incident. And so that's another reason why we needed to come together and be a part of that, because that's the whole reason for ICS in the first place.
That's right.
Go back to
fire scope.
Days.
Yep, yeah. Exactly. Right. A single incident action plan, a single response organization, and a single purchasing department through logistics and finance.
Yeah.
Right? Not 2, not 3, not 5, but 1. So what's involved in the RAC process? When someone calls up and they are activating their plan and they're looking for remote consultation and assessment, what does that look like?
So we have a form that we will send out to the vessel. The vessel master will call our duty officer and talk to them, and the duty officer will send them a form. It's got some basic information about the vessel, And it's really to give us a basic idea of what's going on. We take that form, our duty officer takes that form and pushes it out to the salvage master that's on call. Oftentimes it's a grounding. So I want to know pre-sailing drafts and I want to know post-casualty drafts. In a few hours, I'd really like to have a thorough set of soundings that we're taking since the casualty occurred. Way too often we get stuff that, well, here's the soundings that the chief engineer took on Sunday, last time he checked all his fuel tanks and everything. No, I want to know what these tanks look like now. Pre-casualty and post-casualty draft readings are really, really important. And the accuracy, I can't stress enough the accuracy. There was a propane barge that had a large amount of liquefied propane on board, broke the tow and went aground down in the Florida Keys. So based on the pre-sailing drafts and the grounded drafts that we had, I was going to have to take about 10,000 pounds of propane off this barge in order to refloat it. And so we write the plan up, we get the Coast Guard to buy off on it, we got the local fire department to buy off on it and everything, because, think about this. I got a big propane barge and I'm fixing to light a bunch of flares on top of it.
Is that how you lighted it? You flared it off?
Yeah. I mean, what else are we going to do? Because there's no way of getting another barge to it. But interestingly enough, we never did flare it because as we're doing the planning and everything, I'm standing in about knee-deep water and I'm leaning up against the barge like this. And I'm talking to a guy that's up on the barge. And I said, this thing just moved. And he's like, what? I said, this barge just moved. Long story short, they had gotten the pre-sailing drafts wrong by about 2 feet. So she wasn't near as hard aground as what we thought she was. We took off a couple of 100 pounds, and lightened her up and got a couple of high horsepower speedboats and pulled it off until we got to deep enough water that we could get a tow line to it. We had everything set up. We'd been working on this thing for a couple of days, getting the plan together, getting all the equipment out there, getting everything set up, and then the thing just moved.
Well, this has been a really great conversation. I've appreciated your time. I've learned a lot. Thank you and Resolve for coming on the program.
Thank you for having us.
Great to have you. Todd Duke, General Manager of Compliance Services, Resolve Marine. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of the Tactics Meeting. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Todd Duke from Resolve Marine. If you did enjoy the show, please share it with a colleague, send a tweet, or post it on Facebook. Stay safe. Don't do anything stupid.